Hi everyone, it's Yukimi. Welcome back to the Zainichi Music Project podcast. This is episode 7 titled Foreigners Overnight, in my current series reflecting on Professor John Lee's writing on Zainichi Koreans. As I've mentioned before, I am using his work as a starting point for my own research and for exploring my family history, my memories, and the broader Zainichi experience. In the previous episode, I talked about Soren and the search for dignity and why Korean community institutions became so important to so many first-generation Zainichi Koreans. So today, I want to begin with a question. How can people become foreigners overnight without moving anywhere? Their houses did not move, their neighborhoods did not move, families did not suddenly wake up in another country. What changed was the legal definition placed around them. During Japan's colonial rule of Korea from 1910 to 1945, Koreans were classified as Japanese imperial subjects. They held Japanese nationality on paper, although the status never brought equality. Japan claimed Korean land, labor, resources, and people as part of its empire. Koreans were expected to obey Japanese law and serve the imperial system while being treated as culturally and racially inferior. We were Japanese enough to be ruled by Japan, but never accepted as equal members of the Japanese nation. Then Japan lost World War II, and the empire collapsed. Korea was liberated in 1945, but the Koreans who remained in Japan were left in an uncertain legal position. Around 600,000 stayed. Some had lived in Japan for decades, and a growing number had been born there. Families had already created homes, businesses, neighborhoods, and communities. On April 28, 1952, the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect and restored Japan's sovereignty. Under an administrative decision issued by Japanese Ministry of Justice, Koreans and Taiwanese living in Japan lost their Japanese nationality. They were given no individual choice. People who had been claimed as Japanese subjects under the empire were placed outside the legal boundaries of the post-war nation. This is what Professor Lee captures with the phrase, foreigners overnight. The exclusion had started earlier. Koreans had already been removed from Japanese voter lists and placed under alien registration rules. Still, April 28, 1952 created a decisive legal break. Because Japanese nationality law was based on descent rather than birthplace, children born to Zainichi parents did not automatically receive Japanese citizenship. Foreignness became an inheritance. When we hear the word foreigner, we usually picture someone who arrived from somewhere else. But in 1952, the Korean community included people who had lived in Japan for decades and a growing generation born there. By then, Korea had been divided, the Korean War was underway, and the peninsula had been devastated. As the generations continued, more Zainichi Koreans were born and raised entirely in Japan, speaking Japanese as their first language and knowing no other home. Still, people asked, "Why don't you go back to Korea?" I was asked that question too. Friends and classmates usually said it without obvious malice. Often it came from ignorance, as though it were an ordinary question. But imagine how that makes a child feel. I also remember hearing people say the same thing to my parents. Whenever I heard those words, I felt disgusted, angry, deeply sad, and betrayed. Sometimes they came from people I considered close friends. We spoke the same language, attended the same schools, and shared the same cultural world. Then one casual question revealed how differently they saw me. No matter how long my family had lived in Japan, they still believed we belonged somewhere else. That belief comes from a distorted understanding of how Koreans came to live in Japan. Zainichi Koreans are often described as immigrants, as though our families moved voluntarily between two equal countries and later chose to remain foreign. That framing erases the colonial conditions behind the community. The circumstances varied. Some Koreans came looking for work. Some are recruited as laborers. Some moved because colonial policies had damaged their livelihoods in Korea. Others were forcibly mobilized. There is no single story that represents every Zainichi family, but those movements took place inside an empire. Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. Japan governed Korean life and used Korean labor and resources for imperial expansion. When the empire collapsed, the Koreans who remained were treated as though their presence had little to do with Japanese history. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself as a peaceful, democratic, supposedly homogeneous nation. The presence of Koreans complicated the image because we were living evidence of Japan's colonial past. Rather than being recognized as part of modern Japanese history, we were classified as a foreign population living inside Japan. My grandparents belonged to the generation shaped by this transformation. They spoke Korean as their first language. They also spoke Japanese fluently with a strong Osaka accent. At one point, my maternal grandfather owned a factory in Osaka. I believe the business may have involved metal scrap, although I can't say for certain. What I know is that he became very successful for a long period of time. My mother told me that she was driven around by a chauffeur when she was young. Then the factory burned down and the family lost that wealth. That is almost everything I know. I never asked for the full story, and nobody explained it to me. Somehow, I understood that it was one of those subjects I should avoid. Much of my family history reached us this way, in fragments. We knew something had happened. We saw the consequences, but the adults did not explain the losses, political divisions, or decisions that had shaped their lives. Some subject felt closed before we had even formed the question. Between the ages of 3 and 7, my family lived beside a Chosenkaikan, a Korean community building affiliated with Soren. A few times a year, Japanese right-wing nationalist groups drove through the area in white vans. Through loudspeakers, they shouted, "Get out of Japan!" or "Go back to your own country." I was very young, but children understand the tone. We understand when adults outside believe that our family should not be there. Foreignness was written into official documents, but it also appeared in the sound of those bands outside our home, in the discovery of a Korean name, or in a question from a classmate. It was not always loud. Often it arrived casually. That may be why it was so disorienting. The complicated part is that Japan never fully felt like home to me, and for a long time I didn't understand why. After moving to the United States, I began to recognize that my feeling of standing outside Japanese society was larger than my private family experience. In retrospect, I often felt more foreign in Japan than I have felt as an immigrant in the United States. I entered the United States with a student visa. Later, I went through the work visa process, received a green card, and eventually became a citizen. The process was long and extremely difficult, but there was a legal pathway I could understand. The Zainichi experience came from a different history. We had already been incorporated into Japan's empire. Then we were excluded from the post-war nation that replaced it. I grew up with a special permanent resident status. On an ordinary day, permanent residency could feel almost identical to citizenship. We went to school, worked, paid taxes, and lived our daily lives. Then the government form, an election, a job application, housing, an immigration procedure, or border would bring the difference back into view. Citizenship means that a country recognizes you as one of its people. Permanent residency means that a country permits you to remain. Those are fundamentally different relationships. Growing up, Zainichi often felt like standing outside a glass container, looking in. I spoke the language, understood the customs, and participated in everyday life. Yet, I never felt that I could fully claim the experience as my own. There was always a glass wall. I think that feeling affected my confidence for many years. I constantly doubted myself, struggled to accept my successes, and often believed I was not enough. I couldn't explain every personal struggle through Zainichi history. Human lives are more complicated. But after moving to the United States, I began to understand what sociologist C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination, the ability to see how experiences that feel private and personal can be connected to larger historical and social structures. My confusion did not begin entirely with me. I had inherited something. The post-war Japanese state classified Koreans as foreign nationals, and later generations were born into that classification. I believe Japan should have created birthright citizenship for the children of former colonial subjects who were born and raised there. Foreignness should not have been passed indefinitely from one generation to the next. Naturalization exists, and many Zainichi Koreans chose to become Japanese citizens. That was and remains a legitimate personal decision. Other Zainichi Koreans remained in the ambiguous position between Korea and Japan. For some, that ambiguity was not something to escape. It became a source of pride and a way of holding on to our history. There is no single correct way to be Zainichi. Still, naturalization does not resolve the historical question. Why were people born in Japan required to apply for acceptance into the country where they were born and had spent their entire lives? Why did Zainichi families carry the responsibility for resolving a condition created by colonialism and post-war nationality policy? Today, fourth and fifth generation Zainichi Koreans may experience identity very differently from my generation. Many hold Japanese citizenship. Some feel completely Japanese. Some identify strongly as Korean. Some live comfortably within both identities, while others may have little connection to the political division that shaped earlier generations. Some may not identify with the word Zainichi at all. That is their right. I hope younger generations experience greater freedom and carry less fear and confusion. As I continue this research, I sometimes wonder whether these stories still matter when younger generations may barely recognize the world I grew up in. I believe they do. When conditions change, the history that came before can fade from view. That is why I want to preserve these memories. The injustice of becoming foreigners overnight does not define Zainichi Koreans. Our families built businesses, schools, organizations, and communities. They raised children and created lives with dignity. Professor Lee's phrase describes a legal transformation whose consequences reached far beyond 1952. They entered our documents, names, neighborhoods, memories, and understanding of ourselves. This history belongs within the history of modern Japan. It cannot remain a Korean side story separated from the national narrative. Our families did not move to a foreign country. Japan changed our legal status, and later generations were born inside that decision. Zainichi life continues to change, and I am glad that younger generations may experience greater freedom. But the memory should not disappear. We were there. Our families built lives there. This happened, and it deserves to be remembered. Thank you for listening and for continuing to walk through this history with me. In the next episode, I will talk about this recognition. What happens when a community is historically rooted in a country but remains outside the way that nation understands itself? You can subscribe on Substack or follow the Zainichi Music Project on Instagram and TikTok. More soon.